The last one out in this session is Daniel Nüst, who picks up on the topic of research data and focuses on the issue of reproducibility in his talk, Improving Reproducibility of Geospatial Conference Papers, Lessons Learned from a First Implementation of Reproducibility Reviews. Nüst is a researcher at Spatio-Temporal Modeling Lab at the Institute for Geoinformatics at the University of Münster. He works on open tools and processes to enable and improve computational reproducibility in the project Opening Reproducible Research. So welcome to you, Daniel.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you also for the nice introduction and my previous speakers for setting the bar so high. My name is Daniel Nüst, and I have the honor this year to serve as the Agile Conference's Reproducibility Chair. On behalf of my fellow Reproducibility Committee members who are listed here, I would like to talk to you today about the lessons learned from the first year of reproducibility reviews at a community-led conference in GI Science. I'll put the link to the slides in the chat now so you can follow at your own pace. Note that there are full-text speaker notes if you ever want to take a look at the talk again. So the Association of Geographic Information Laboratories in Europe, or short AGILE, was established in 1998 to promote academic teaching and research on geographic information at the European level. AGILE consists of 60 geographic information laboratories at universities all over Europe, making it an association of groups rather than individuals. AGILE is managed by an 8-person council elected by its members. The main activities include organization of a yearly GI conference, PhD schools, and also instigation and support of initiatives on topics relevant for the community. So 2 workshops in 2017 and 2018, and a piece of meta-research into the reproducibility of papers published at the Agile conference were the basis for a small group of members from the Agile community to apply for an initiative to develop guidelines for reproducible publications. The Agile Council granted support for the initiative, and the guidelines were published shortly before the conference in 2019. A year later, the guidelines were for the first time recommended in the call for papers, and for the first time, a reproducibility review was put into place to evaluate the reproducibility of accepted papers. So find out more at the Reproducible Agile website. Today, I will introduce the guidelines, and then I'll talk about the reproducibility review process at the last conference in detail and try to summarize the results and lessons learned in a way that makes them useful for other communities. So let's take a look at the guidelines. They are the first compilation of tips and tools how to increase transparency and reproducibility in GI science papers. They are complemented with a wiki with examples for typical GI science datasets and workflows. The guidelines' intention is to promote positive examples of reproducible computational research and to acknowledge the full spectrum of reproducibility, as well as the transition towards establishment of reproducible research practices. The only requirement of the guidelines is that each paper must include a data and software availability subsection, or DASA section for short. It is absolutely possible not to provide access to data and code and to still comply with the guidelines at the same time, as long as there are good reasons given. These are the contents of the guidelines. Primarily, they include author guidelines. These give advice how to incorporate data and computational workflows in research papers and how to write the data and software availability section. There is also a pre-submission checklist for authors. The document also includes some background on the rationale and motivation, as well as reviewer guidelines and brand new in the current draft reproducibility reviewer guidelines. I will skip the details of the author guidelines, but I'd like to take a look at the brand new reproducibility reviewer guidelines because they really set the tone and scope of how we do reproducibility reviews. Your feedback would be much appreciated, and a link to the draft document is at the bottom of this slide. We try to be transparent about the ideal steps and more realistic steps a reproducibility reviewer might take. Ideal is if the reproducibility reviewer reads the abstract and the DASA section, follows the instructions in the README of the code to reproduce the computations and then writes his short report. More realistic, however, is read the abstract and the data section, skim the methods section, identify which figures were generated with the computer, follow all the links in the data section, start the reproduction by trying to connect the figures with the respective code or scripts, and then communicate with the author if you have some questions, retry the reproduction, improve the documentation of the computing environment, and then finish the reproduction maybe only partially, and finally write the report, which might have many recommendations what authors could improve, and then be done. The role is set out to be critical reviewer, but also in part educator. Reviewers should encourage and motivate, but not fix any problems. So we accept irreproducibility if the author is not interested in making it work. Regarding reproducibility reviewer skills, we see familiarity with package managers and virtual environments as crucial. While anyone should be able to reproduce any workflow with enough time and good enough documentation, we recommend to ask the author for help if one cannot get started within minutes, and stop if getting a workflow to run takes longer than an hour. The section ends with a table of do's and don'ts of reproducibility reviewer behavior. Here are some examples. Do not fix bugs. Do encourage and share your knowledge by giving feedback. Do document your provided feedback in the reproducibility report to ensure traceability of the reproducibility reviewer's scientific contribution. Do acknowledge that challenges that individual authors might face, for example, structural, institutional, or personal disadvantages. And finally, the hardest don't, in my experience, no rummaging. So it's really hard to not to get excited and dig deeper all the time, and always feeling I'm so close to getting this workflow done and getting it reproduced. So how did the first ever reproducibility review at Agile Conference go? A few words about the process, and there's more details in the linked document. Let's start with the order. The reproducibility review happened after the authors were notified about the acceptance or rejection. Ideally, we wanted to review only papers that were identified by the scientific reviewers, but we found that that was not reliable, so we briefly checked all papers ourselves. None of the regular reviewers could be intrigued to attempt a reproduction. So this reduced the number of papers and allowed us to communicate directly with the authors during the reproducibility reviews. The process was not smooth because Agile is a community-led conference managed by volunteers, and the authors are the ones who prepare the camera-ready copies of the articles. So there's a lot of moving parts with no central control that has that as a sole job. On top of that, the conference switched the publisher last year, and the coronavirus, of course, wrecked all schedules that we had. Eventually, the papers were published, and the publisher added badges on the landing pages of the proceedings, which you can see here on the screenshots at the right-hand side. These badges link to the reproducibility reports. The papers themselves do not reference the reports at the moment. We originally planned to have short presentations of selected reproducible papers in the final conference session, where candidates for the Best Paper Award are presented and voted live by the audience. Unfortunately, the in-person event was cancelled, so we could not have this showcase of the first batch of reproducible papers as we would have liked to. So 6 reproductions were partially successful, partially because not all details of the computational results, for example, not all figures that are present in the paper were reproducible. 16 papers were assessed as impossible to reproduce early on for different reasons. And here are some barriers that we faced. If authors provided no starting point at all, that is, no link to data or code, we did not attempt a reproduction, even if there was clearly a computational workflow. We neither contacted the authors in these cases. Often, documentation was not detailed enough for a third party to reproduce a workflow. For example, a generic dataset citation or manual steps in retrieving data. Also, anonymization that was not removed in a timely manner. So the authors submitted an anonymized manuscript. They were notified. We asked them, hey, can you send us your public links now? And we didn't hear back from the authors. Some papers use sensitive data on human subjects or confidential or commercial data, which we did not have access to. Some papers relied on proprietary software, which we cannot trust that or cannot rely on the reviewer having access to as well. One paper was simply describing a piece of software, which is fine, but didn't give us anything to evaluate. And similarly, in previous years of the conference, we observed purely conceptual papers, which of course are also not computationally reproducible. In all of these cases, authors could have documented the reasons themselves for not providing this information, for example, in the data section, but only few of them did. So let's take a look at some aspects of all the reproducibility reports that we created. The first one on the left is a paper that has a data section and a GitHub repository and a Zenodo deposit of the GitHub repository. But it still wasn't perfect. The Zenodo copy of the material, for example, was outdated. On the right, there is a paper that used an anonymous figure record, which is a great solution to support anonymous peer review, but not all figures could be reproduced and small improvements needed to be made. For example, a seed was missing for the randomly created word clouds that you also see here on the right-hand side. On the left here is a paper with good efforts, despite very strict platforms' terms of service. The authors could not publish the social media data and instead had to provide the tweet identifiers, which is very good practice. This article was mostly reproduced, just the maps we couldn't reproduce, after we asked the authors for some additional documentation. Over on the right, the paper had a workflow where undocumented specifics in the computing environment provided considerable hurdles for the reproducing people, although the authors provided a Jupyter notebook, which is a very good start for reproducible research and worked quite well. Lots of disk space and processing power were needed, but eventually a largely successful reproduction was achieved. So the final two, on the left, we have a paper that used an anonymous supplement, but needed some going back and forth between author and reviewer to get the workflow right. The authors provided a textual definition of the computing environment, which the reproducibility reviewer turned into a standardized format. Eventually, the plots were pretty close to the originals from the paper, though you can see here at the bottom half of the left side that the axis labels are illegible in the reproductions, and of course these are perfect in the published paper. On the right-hand side, we have a paper with data and code on OSF, the Open Science Framework. With a lot of trial and error, with some help from the authors, eventually we got a subset of the workflow running because the full analysis was much too large. It would have taken, I think, days or even weeks. The recreated figures, however, was still close enough to the original to trust that everything to create the full analysis is there, though there was no perfect match. So please take a look at these reports and let me know if you think they're useful for students or readers and reviewers and how we can improve them. So what do we do with these reports now? Besides publishing the reports in OSF and linking to them from the proceedings website, as shown on previous slide, the Agile Conference's reproducibility reports are published in the CodeCheck register. The CodeCheck initiative tries to establish independent executions of computations that underlie research articles as part of peer review. CodeCheck defines a set of principles which we at Agile try to embrace. The register links and data and code repositories with the DOI of the report and is available under an open license for integration with other services. So this is the first reproducibility review at an Agile conference, and as you can expect from the first time, we deviated quite a lot from the original plan. So here's what we learned. We saw the full spectrum of reproducibility, which encourages us to continue with our current approach. So we saw papers that needed some improvement, but also papers that were close to very good. We saw that compared to previous year submissions, the guidelines did effectively increase community awareness and improved reproducibility. Of course, we also looked harder than before, but we are still very happy with the overall outcome. Almost all reproduced papers have the data section, and all follow them at least in part. So that's a great sign that even recommended guidelines have impact. The reproducibility reports have a lot of details with recommendations how to improve workflows. Some authors pick these up pretty quickly and even improve their material in time with the publication of the articles, which I think is a great reward for the reproducibility reviewers. Also, good practices spread slowly because people need to change their sometimes even daily habits. This also led us to being less strict than originally anticipated. But that's a good flexibility, I think, to let the community of authors influence the pace of change as well. Slow change can be a good thing if it allows you to let everybody come with you. And finally, the process cannot be established at once, but needs to be improved over time, especially the coordination with other conference committees and the publisher. For example, we plan to not allow authors to object the publication of the reproducibility report anymore, which they could have done this year, but no one did. Since only successful reproductions will be published anyway, we don't see a need for this additional step. And anyway, the need to credit the reviewer also outweighs possible reviewer authors' concerns here. So these are the most common challenges that reproducibility reviewers faced. We found inconsistencies between the versions and identifiers used in the data deposit and the manuscript. So that is why one of the main reasons why proper depositing, that is with the DOI, of data encode is important. On top of that, there's a lack of connections between the figures in the paper and the documentation code. So that really slows down reviewers. Workspace layout and methods often were not accessible for third parties, so no clear README files, usage of absolute paths. So these are things that the guidelines do cover, but authors seem to be unaware of, or they seem to be unaware how tedious it is for other people to figure those out, what just works on your own machine. Another challenge is undocumented runtime. So it can happen that you start the process and after 24 hours, it tells you there's 10% progress. Authors need to be aware of this and provide subsets for quicker evaluation of methods. So this is related to the challenge that due to the lack of experiences, we did not provide any guidance on how much time reviewers should spend before stopping. So I estimate that we spent 4 to 10 person hours per peer review this year, not including running the actual computations. That is a time that's, of course, in the long term, not feasible for us to spend. To summarize, I would say that these are all problems outside of the mere execution of the workflow. This is where authors can do a better job as well to reduce the time needed to understand the method by preparing more reproducible workflows. And we are slowly working towards that. Trying to attempt a reproduction yourself could be a great way to increase mutual understanding. So in just 3 years, we were able to plant the seed of cultural and structural change, if I myself may say so. So here's how to put your community on a path towards more reproducibility in 5 easy or not so easy steps. First, build a team of enthusiasts, for example, by organizing a workshop. Second, assess the current state and talk about it. So this is how people will realize you're serious. In our case, it was pre-conference workshops and a paper with a really strong result and message. Third, try to get institutional support. In our case, the support of the Agile Council and the conference committee chairs made everything possible. 4, try to get the community on your side by staying positive and inclusive. Irreproducibility is usually not a sign for bad science, but a lack of knowledge and incentives which you can try to create. And finally, keep at it because cultural change takes time. So putting reproducibility on the map of your community is already an achievement in itself, and every little step counts. So providing feedback as part of the reproducibility reviews will, one author at a time, educate your community too. So I'd like to finish with a short outlook on the next steps. Most importantly, we are doing it again next year, and we try to learn from our own experiences, of course. Furthermore, the guidelines will be improved. Most likely, we will simplify them and move details to other places. I'm keen on having the guidelines translated to make them more accessible, and I hope they find adoption even beyond our own conference. We need to grow the reproducibility reviewer team, which I think is a great opportunity to involve early career researchers in peer review. More people means more diverse skill sets to better match the given manuscripts. I hope that we will be able to give reproducibility and regular reviewers public credit soon, for example, by putting reviewer activity into the ORCID profiles. We continue to research the state of reproducibility in GI science, and have just published a preprint on another conference series, the GI Science Conference. The results are equally sobering as for the Agile conference 3 years ago. And of course, the continued interaction with the community is key to increase reproducibility further. We will debate the scope of the review and when to increase requirements, maybe even require reproductions for acceptance at some point. In the long term, I personally hope the awareness on reproducibility is a starting point for more open practice in general. For example, requiring tenured reviewers to disclose their identity, accept first submissions without formatting, or using the credit taxonomy for author contributions. And most importantly, I'd be completely fine to phase out the special reproducibility review when reproducible papers have become standard practice. So I look forward to your questions at the end of the session. Feel free to email me or reach out to me on Twitter. And I want to thank my fellow members of the Reproducibility Committee for their hard work. So thank you, Frank, Carlos, and Alex, for contributing to the reviews this year. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Daniel. We're moving straight into the questions and the answers. And I think I'm actually going to start with you, Daniel, since you are, is it Daniel or Daniel? I do apologize for all the mispronunciations of the names.
Fine. Daniel is perfect.
Daniel is perfect. Okay, so there's a question to you here. It says, very interesting work. This seems the way to go, but it is also very resource intensive, time computation, reviewer competency, etc. Any thoughts on how this squares with a general increase in reviewer workload and issues with finding good reviewers reported by editors?
So I agree, it makes finding reviewers even harder because if you try to find reviewers who can review both the scientific aspect and the computational aspect, that can be really hard. I think having an extra role of reproducibility reviewer can relax the problem there a little bit, because you can have two people who look at the science because they understand the science, and one person who doesn't necessarily have to understand the science, but knows the programming language well. I think that could also often be the case for early career researchers, which might be good at getting the code to work, but not necessarily have the experience to judge the science. So it's resource intensive. There's no way around that besides educating authors to provide more user-friendly, reviewer-friendly material. And I think what I pointed out there, for me, giving credit is crucial, that you're not just listed on some website, that you are on some committee, but that there is a public record of the reproductions you do. And in our case, the reproducibility reports are public. So everybody can check what if I did a good job as a reviewer. And I hope that sort of helps out in the effort that people have to spend.
Thank you. Another questions for Daniel here. Great talk, very interesting. You mentioned many things we also experience in the field of economics. Maybe I missed this, but what was the reason to conduct the reproductions after the acceptance of the paper?
Right. So I think one is just a procedural decision when we found time in the schedule to do it. And also at the moment, we decided not to make irreproducibility a reason for rejection. So we want to promote the papers that are reproducible, but there are still, 16 accepted papers at the conference which we couldn't reproduce, but there's still sound science behind that. So I think that's the decision to make that also clear to the authors and sort of take the pressure off a little bit and say, you can get accepted and then we will take a look. I personally am, of course, interested in maybe switching that around and giving, for example, the scientific reviewers a chance to take a look at a reproducibility review report to also consider that in their decision.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. And maybe you've already been answering this, Daniel, but reproducibility is, of course, key in the quality assurance of science and for maintaining trust in research. Based on your experience, is it likely to expect journals and conferences in general to invest resources in reproducibility review processes like the one you've just told us about?
I think it would be wrong if they don't. So open science, as much as reproducible research, are to some like contradictions in terms. They are terms that are used to describe that in reproducible research, for example, in the last 20 years, we've been using computers in a pretty careless way. We expect that we close the computer today and open it tomorrow, and it's still all the same, which is not the case if you know how computers and software works. And I think that at some point we will just talk about science and research, and reproducibility will be a standard thing. And what is why I'm confident saying that is because some journals are now increasing their requirements for openness of methods even more. I think all serious journals have clear guidelines on open data, and open software is just a question of time when that will also be required. So I always say younger researchers start working reproducibly now, because your advisors cannot tell you how to do that. They've made a career in a world where that was not required. But if you still want to publish research in 10 years' time, you should sort of up your game on reproducibility as soon as possible.
Thank you. And I think with that look into the future, we'll end this question session.